We've seen how we can tell Git which files that it ought to ignore inside of our working directory. And we did that by putting a git ignore file in the root of our working directory and even storing and committing that to our repository. But what if we find ourselves ignoring the same files over and over in all of our different projects in each of our different Git repositories? Or as we saw in the last movie, some of the files that we want to ignore are operating specific files. We want to ignore them all the time because they're just generally the kind of thing that we don't want to track. Well, to do this, we're going to configure Git to globally ignore some files. That means that we ignore those files in all repositories, not just in any one specific repository. And these settings for this global ignore are not going to be inside the repository. They're going to live outside of it, right? It's part of our Git configuration, not our project configuration, but our Git configuration. So what that means is it's not going to be stored in the repository. People who use our repository, if someone downloads it and starts working with it, they're not going to get it. And so we've traded repository-specific ignores for user-specific ignores. They exist only on my machine. Now that's good because it means that I can configure it exactly the way I like it. I can ignore the files that I want to ignore, and I don't have to worry about what someone else wants to ignore. Okay, I can just ignore my preferences. Now that can be good. For example, if I'm working on a Mac and someone else using the repository is working on Windows, then we can each have our own git ignore files that are specific to our operating system. We don't have to share those. But on the other hand, if I've told it to ignore all log files, files ending in .log, and that's in my global config, but not the project config, then if someone else starts using the repository, then they're going to always be prompted by Git to try and track the log file. That is, unless they also ignore the log file. So you just want to keep in mind the difference and consider whether you want an ignored file to be listed in your user-specific ignores or your repository-specific ignores. Okay, so how to actually do the ignoring? Well, we do that using git config. We saw this back when we were setting up Git at the beginning. We do git config with the global option and then core.excludes file, and we tell it where the file is. So the file can be named anything we want. We can locate it wherever we want. We just have to tell Git in its config file, hey, this is the file you should use for globally ignoring things. Let's try creating one. So right now, I'm inside my Explorer California directory, where I'm going to put my global ignore is in my user directory, right here. That's where my git config was before. If you remember ls-la, and inside users, Kevin Skogland, you'll see that's where I've got my global git config file. So I'm going to put the git ignore file right alongside it. You can create a number of different ways. You can use a text editor. I'm going to use the Nano text editor that's in Mac OS X and in Unix. It's just a real simple text editor, and tell it that it ought to go to users, Kevin Skogland, and create a file called git ignore _ global. Now again, you can call it anything you want. Some people just call it git ignore. I'm going to call it git ignore global, so it's just very clear that it's a global file. So inside that file, then we can put whatever things we want to ignore. Because I'm on a Mac, the things that I want to ignore most often are .ds _ store and .trashes and .spotlight -v100. Those are just a couple of things that often pop up that need to get ignored. And they're files that the operating system is using to keep track of various things. So I'm just going to go ahead and close that now. Say yes, and let's save it to that file name that I gave it. Now if we check again, LA, users, Kevin Skogland, there we are. Now you can see that that file is there. And then the last thing I need to do is tell git config about that file. So git config -- global core.excludes file, and then the path to the file. Let me just clear the screen so it's clear. The short version in Unix is just use this tilde that represents your user directory. So you could say tilde.git ignore _ global. That's what I would probably do. But you can also do it with a full path, which is what you would do on Windows. And we'll put in the full thing, Kevin Skogland. That's the full path to get there. So then we hit return. It'll add it to our config file. If we take a look at that config file, cat users Kevin Skogland .git config, we can see that it added that excludes file right here. So now that's the file that it will be using for global git ignores. It'll ignore those files in every repository on my machine.